Picture this. The most powerful man in the world stands before a beautiful young boy, not yet 20 years old. With trembling hands, he places a wedding veil over the youth's head. The assembled crowd watches in stunned silence as the Emperor of Rome, Nero Caesar Augustus, prepares to marry this boy in a ceremony that will shock the ancient world. But this is no ordinary wedding. This boy has been chosen for one horrifying reason. He bears an uncanny resemblance to Nero's beloved wife, who died under mysterious circumstances just months before. The boy's name is Sporus, and his story is one of the most disturbing and tragic tales from ancient Rome. A story of obsession, manipulation, and the terrifying lengths to which absolute power can drive a man when grief consumes his soul. What you're about to discover challenges everything you thought you knew about love, power, and the darkest corners of human nature. This is not just the story of a mad emperor and his victim. It's a window into a world where the line between love and possession, between devotion and destruction, became so blurred that it created one of history's most shocking relationships. The year is 67 AD. The Roman Empire stretches from Britain to the Middle East, encompassing millions of people under the rule of one man. That man is Nero, and he has just done something so scandalous, so unprecedented, that it will be talked about for thousands of years. He has taken a young freedman, had him castrated, and transformed him into a replacement for his dead wife. But how did it come to this? What drove the Emperor of Rome to such desperate measures? And what happened to the young man caught in the web of imperial madness? To understand this extraordinary story, we must first travel back to the beginning, to a time when Nero was not yet the monster history remembers, but a young man who fell deeply, obsessively in love. Rome in the 1st century AD was a city of contradictions. Magnificent marble temples stood alongside crowded tenements. Senators debated philosophy, while gladiators fought to the death just miles away. It was a world where absolute power corrupted absolutely, where emperors could elevate a man to the heavens or condemn him to the underworld with a single word. Into this world was born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in the year 37 AD. You know him better as Nero. His early life was marked by tragedy and political intrigue. His father died when he was just 3 years old. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was a woman of fierce ambition who would stop at nothing to see her son on the throne. Agrippina was the sister of the Emperor Caligula and the niece of Claudius, who would later become emperor himself. She understood power in a way that few women of her time could. When Claudius became emperor, she seduced him and convinced him to adopt her son Nero as his heir, pushing aside Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. The young Nero was tutored by Seneca, one of Rome's greatest philosophers, who tried to instill in him the virtues of Stoicism, self-control, wisdom, and justice. But philosophy could not compete with the intoxicating rush of absolute power that awaited the future emperor. In 54 AD, when Nero was just 16 years old, Emperor Claudius died suddenly. Many suspected poison, and whispers pointed to Agrippina as the culprit. Whether true or not, her son Nero ascended to the throne as the youngest emperor in Roman history. The early years of Nero's reign were actually quite promising. Guided by Seneca and his co-advisor Burrus, Nero implemented several popular reforms. He reduced taxes, gave more power to the Senate, and provided aid to cities affected by natural disasters. The people loved their young emperor, and it seemed as though Rome had found a worthy successor to Augustus. But power has a way of revealing a person's true nature, and Nero's true nature was dark indeed. The first signs of trouble emerged in his personal relationships. Nero was married to Claudius's daughter Octavia, a political arrangement that secured his claim to the throne. But Nero had little love for his wife, whom he found cold and uninteresting. His heart belonged elsewhere. In 58 AD, Nero met a woman who would change the course of his life forever. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she was breathtakingly beautiful. Poppaea had golden hair that caught the light like spun silk, eyes that sparkled with intelligence and cunning, and a grace that made her the most desirable woman in Rome. But Poppaea was no ordinary beauty. She was married to Otho, one of Nero's closest friends, and she was as ambitious as she was lovely. She understood that her beauty was a weapon, and she wielded it with deadly precision. The affair between Nero and Poppaea began slowly, carefully. Secret meetings in shadowed corners of the palace, stolen glances across crowded rooms, messages passed between trusted servants. But passion, especially the passion of an emperor, cannot be contained for long. Nero became obsessed with Poppaea. He would cancel state meetings to spend time with her. He showered her with gifts, precious jewels, silk from China, perfumes from Arabia. He even had her portrait painted on the walls of his private chambers, so he could gaze upon her face even when they were apart. But Poppaea wanted more than just to be Nero's mistress. She wanted to be his empress, and that meant Octavia had to go. The problem was that divorcing Octavia would be politically disastrous. She was popular with the people and connected to powerful families. Worse still, Nero's mother, Agrippina, disapproved of Poppaea and threatened to support Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, as a rival claimant to the throne. What happened next reveals the true depths of Nero's capacity for evil. In 59 AD, Nero arranged for his mother's murder. The details are horrifying. First, he tried to have her killed in a collapsing boat designed to sink in the Bay of Naples. When she survived by swimming to shore, he sent assassins to finish the job. Agrippina, realizing her son intended to kill her, reportedly bared her womb and cried out for the killers to strike there first, since it had given birth to such a monster. With his mother dead, Nero was free to pursue his desires without restraint. In 62 AD, he divorced Octavia on charges of adultery, charges that were almost certainly fabricated. Just 12 days later, he married Poppaea in a lavish ceremony that scandalized Rome. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Nero had everything he wanted. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he was married to the woman he loved above all others. Poppaea gave him a daughter, Claudia Augusta, though the child died in infancy. Still, their love seemed genuine, passionate, and all-consuming. But this happiness would not last. In fact, it would end in a way so shocking that it would drive Nero to the most desperate act of his reign. The year 65 AD brought both triumph and tragedy to Nero's reign. The emperor was at the height of his power, having survived several assassination attempts and consolidated his control over the empire. He had also indulged his artistic ambitions, performing publicly as an actor and musician, despite the scandal this caused among the Roman elite, who considered such performances beneath the dignity of an emperor. Poppaea had been by his side through it all, her beauty and wit making her the unofficial queen of Rome. She had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of imperial politics, using her influence to protect her interests and eliminate her enemies. By all accounts, despite the violence that had marked their path to marriage, Nero and Poppaea genuinely loved each other. But Poppaea had a temper to match her beauty, and she was not afraid to use it, even against the emperor himself. The fatal argument began over something seemingly trivial. Nero had spent the day at the races, betting on chariot teams and celebrating with his friends long into the evening. When he returned to the palace, Poppaea confronted him about his absence. She was pregnant again, and perhaps the discomforts of pregnancy made her more irritable than usual. Or perhaps she had simply grown tired of competing with Nero's other obsessions for his attention. What exactly was said between them, we'll never know for certain. The historical accounts vary, but they all agree on one crucial point. The argument escalated far beyond mere words. According to the historian Tacitus, Nero flew into a rage and kicked Poppaea in the stomach. Other sources suggest he pushed her down a flight of stairs. The exact method doesn't matter. What matters is that Poppaea Sabina, the woman Nero loved more than life itself, died that night in 65 AD, along with their unborn child. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Servants ran through the palace corridors, their faces pale with terror. Doctors were summoned, but there was nothing they could do. The Empress was dead, and with her died any hope Nero had of finding genuine happiness. The Emperor's reaction to Poppaea's death was unlike anything Rome had ever witnessed. He didn't retreat into stoic acceptance, as a Roman was supposed to do in the face of tragedy. He didn't even fly into a typical rage, executing servants and advisors as he had done so many times before. Instead, Nero collapsed completely. He fell to his knees beside Poppaea's body and wept like a child. He refused to eat, to sleep, to attend to any matters of state. For days, he simply sat beside her corpse, talking to her as if she were still alive, begging her forgiveness, promising to make everything right. When the time came for the funeral, Nero spared no expense. Poppaea's body was not cremated according to Roman custom, but embalmed in the Egyptian fashion and placed in a golden sarcophagus. The funeral procession stretched for miles, with thousands of mourners, many of them paid, weeping and wailing as they followed the Empress to her final rest. But even this elaborate ceremony could not fill the void in Nero's heart. As the months passed, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He would spend hours staring at Poppaea's portraits, commissioning new statues of her to be placed throughout the palace. He had her favorite rooms sealed off, preserved exactly as she had left them. The emperor, who had once shown promise as a ruler, now neglected his duties entirely. He ignored reports from the provinces, failed to appear at Senate meetings, and left important decisions to his advisors while he wallowed in grief. Rome began to whisper. Some said the emperor had gone mad. Others wondered if the gods were punishing him for his crimes, the murder of his mother, the execution of his first wife, the countless other acts of cruelty that had marked his reign. But the whispers grew louder when news spread of what Nero was looking for. The emperor had sent agents throughout the empire with a single strange mission: find someone who looked exactly like Poppaea Sabina. The search was exhaustive and desperate. Nero's men scoured every province, every city, every village. They examined thousands of women, looking for the golden hair, the sparkling eyes, the graceful bearing that had made Poppaea so captivating. But they found no one. How could they? Poppaea had been unique, her beauty the product of countless chance combinations of genetics and circumstance. She could not be replaced, could not be replicated, could not be brought back from the dead. And that's when Nero made a decision that would shock the ancient world and create one of history's most disturbing love stories. If he could not find a woman who looked like Poppaea, he would create one. The young man who would become the center of Nero's obsession was born with the name Sporus sometime around 50 AD. He was likely from Greece or Asia Minor, regions known for producing beautiful youths who were prized in Roman society for their looks and refinement. Sporus had been born into slavery, as were millions of people throughout the Roman Empire. But his master had recognized something special in the boy, an unusual beauty that could prove valuable in the right circumstances. So instead of sending Sporus to labor in fields or mines, he had the boy educated and trained in the social graces that would make him attractive to wealthy Romans. At some point, Sporus had been freed from slavery and became a freedman, still bound to his former master, but legally free and able to own property. He was likely working as a companion or entertainer, using his looks and charm to make a living in the complex social hierarchy of Roman society. He was probably no older than 17 when Nero's agents found him in 66 AD. The resemblance was startling. Sporus had the same delicate features as Poppaea, the same golden hair, the same graceful movements. His face was softer, more feminine than most young men, and his voice had a musical quality that reminded those who heard it of the dead empress. When Nero first laid eyes on Sporus, the effect was immediate and profound. Here, standing before him, was the answer to his prayers. Not Poppaea herself, of course, that was impossible, but someone who could fill the void she had left behind. Someone who could help him forget, even for a moment, the crushing weight of his grief and guilt. But there was a problem. Sporus was male, and while Roman society was relatively tolerant of homosexual relationships, especially between older men and younger partners, what Nero had in mind went far beyond social convention. He didn't want Sporus as a lover or companion. He wanted him as a replacement wife. What happened next represents one of the most shocking acts of bodily violation in recorded history. Nero ordered that Sporus be castrated. The procedure was carried out by imperial physicians, likely using techniques developed for creating eunuchs to serve in Oriental courts. It was a brutal, dangerous operation that killed many who underwent it. But Sporus survived, forever changed in body and spirit. The castration served multiple purposes in Nero's twisted logic. It would prevent Sporus from developing more masculine features as he aged, preserving his resemblance to Poppaea. It would also symbolically transform him from male to something in between, neither fully man nor woman, but a creature that existed solely for Nero's pleasure and comfort. But the physical transformation was only the beginning. Over the following months, Nero set about reshaping every aspect of Sporus's existence to match his memories of Poppaea. The young man was given a complete new wardrobe, consisting entirely of women's clothing in the styles that Poppaea had favored. He was taught to walk like her, to gesture like her, to speak in the soft, melodious tones that had once captivated the emperor. Teams of servants worked to style his hair exactly like Poppaea's, using oils and perfumes to recreate even her distinctive scent. Sporus was also given jewelry that had once belonged to the dead empress. Rings, necklaces, bracelets that still carried the memory of her touch. He was housed in rooms that had been Poppaea's, surrounded by her possessions, expected to sleep in her bed and wear her clothes as if he were truly her reincarnation. The psychological impact of this transformation on Sporus himself is something we can only imagine. Here was a young man who had been brutally mutilated and forced to abandon his own identity completely. Every aspect of his former self, his name, his appearance, his manner of dress and speech, had been erased and replaced with those of a dead woman. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire process was that Nero seemed to genuinely believe it was working. As Sporus became more skilled at mimicking Poppaea's mannerisms, the emperor began to treat him not as a substitute or replacement, but as if he were actually Poppaea herself, returned from the dead. And then came the wedding. The ceremony took place in 67 AD, approximately 2 years after Poppaea's death. By Roman law, it was not a legal marriage. Two males could not be legally wed, and Sporus's castration did not change his fundamental legal status as a man. But Nero didn't care about Roman law. He was the emperor, and he would have his wedding. The preparations were elaborate and expensive, rivaling those of Nero's marriage to Poppaea herself. The ceremony was held in one of Nero's private villas, attended by a select group of senators, courtiers, and other high-ranking officials who dared not refuse the emperor's invitation, no matter how bizarre they found the proceedings. Sporus was dressed in traditional bridal attire, a flowing white gown, a veil that covered his face, jewelry that sparkled in the torchlight. He had been trained extensively for this moment, coached in how to stand, how to move, how to respond to the various parts of the ceremony. But what must it have been like for him, standing there before the most powerful man in the world, knowing that his entire future depended on successfully pretending to be someone else? The terror, the confusion, the complete helplessness of his situation. These are emotions we can barely comprehend. Nero, for his part, played his role with complete conviction. He wore the traditional toga of a Roman groom and spoke his vows with tears streaming down his face. Not tears of joy, but tears of grief and desperate hope. In his mind, he was not marrying a mutilated young man, but reclaiming his beloved Poppaea from the realm of the dead. The witnesses to this ceremony were forced to participate in Nero's delusion. They offered congratulations and gifts. They raised toasts to the happy couple. They pretended that what they were witnessing was normal and appropriate. To do otherwise would have meant death. But the wedding was only the beginning of Sporus's ordeal. What followed was perhaps even more disturbing than what had come before. Nero treated his new wife exactly as he had treated Poppaea. Sporus was given the title of empress, though this had no legal meaning. He was expected to appear at state functions, to receive foreign dignitaries, to play the role of the emperor's consort in all public and private matters. More disturbingly, Nero insisted on complete physical intimacy with Sporus, treating him as if he were truly female. The castration had been designed not just to preserve Sporus's feminine appearance, but to make this possible. The young man was expected to submit to Nero's desires without question, to respond as Poppaea would have responded, to provide the emperor with the illusion of his lost love's presence. The effect on Sporus's mental state can only be imagined. He was living a constant lie, forced to suppress every aspect of his true self in service of another man's delusion. He could never express his own thoughts, his own feelings, his own desires. He existed solely as a vessel for Nero's memories and fantasies. And yet, he had no choice but to play the role perfectly. Any sign that the illusion was failing, any moment when Nero was forced to confront the reality of what Sporus actually was, could have meant instant death. So Sporus learned to be Poppaea completely, to lose himself so thoroughly in the role that perhaps, at times, he too forgot who he had once been. The Roman elite watched this bizarre relationship with a mixture of horror and disgust. Many saw it as proof that Nero had finally crossed the line from mere cruelty into complete madness. But they were too afraid to speak openly about their concerns. After all, this was an emperor who had already murdered his mother, his wife, and countless others who had displeased him. Still, the whispers grew louder. How long could this charade continue? What would happen when Nero tired of his living doll? And what did this say about the state of the empire when its ruler was so consumed by grief and madness that he could no longer distinguish between reality and fantasy. These questions would soon be answered in ways that no one could have predicted. For nearly 2 years, the strange marriage between Nero and Sporus continued. The young man who had once been a simple freedman now lived in the heart of the Roman Empire's power structure, occupying a position that was simultaneously the most privileged and most precarious in the known world. Sporus had become remarkably skilled at his role. He had studied Poppaea's mannerisms so thoroughly that even those who had known her personally sometimes found themselves momentarily convinced by the illusion. He moved with her grace, spoke with her inflection, even laughed with her particular musical quality. In the soft light of oil lamps, wearing her jewelry and perfumes, he could almost pass for her ghost. But maintaining this facade required constant vigilance. Every moment of every day, Sporus had to remember to be someone else. A single slip, a gesture too masculine, a voice too deep, a moment of forgetting to respond to his assumed name could shatter Nero's delusion and bring terrible consequences. The strain was enormous. Imagine living every moment of your life in performance, never allowed to relax into your true self, never permitted to express your own thoughts or feelings or desires. It was a kind of psychological torture that went beyond physical abuse, a complete erasure of identity that few human beings could endure for long. Yet Sporus endured it because he had no choice. He had learned to read Nero's moods with extraordinary precision, knowing exactly when to be playful and when to be serious, when to offer comfort and when to remain silent. He had become a master of giving the emperor exactly what he needed at any given moment. And what Nero needed, more than anything else, was the illusion that his greatest sin could be undone. In Sporus, he found not just a replacement for Poppaea, but a kind of absolution. If he could love Sporus as he had loved her, if he could treat him with the tenderness he had failed to show her in life, then perhaps he could quiet the guilt that gnawed at his soul. But by 68 AD, Nero's hold on power was beginning to slip. The empire was facing multiple crises simultaneously. There were revolts in Gaul and Spain. The military was increasingly disloyal. The treasury was nearly empty, drained by Nero's extravagant spending on public games, artistic performances, and personal luxuries. More importantly, the Roman elite had grown tired of their emperor's excesses. The marriage to Sporus was just the latest in a long series of scandals that had undermined Nero's authority. Senators whispered of replacing him with someone more suitable, someone who understood the dignity and responsibility that came with imperial power. The crisis came to a head when Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, openly declared his rebellion against Nero's rule. This act of defiance encouraged others to follow suit. Soon, several provincial governors had joined the revolt, and even more ominously, they had found a candidate to replace Nero, Servius Sulpicius Galba, an elderly senator with an impeccable reputation and strong military connections. As news of the spreading rebellion reached Rome, Nero's behavior became even more erratic. He alternated between grandiose fantasies of crushing his enemies and paralyzing depression that left him unable to function. Through it all, Sporus remained by his side, playing his role as the devoted wife, offering comfort and support even as the empire crumbled around them. But the end was approaching faster than either of them realized. In June of 68 AD, the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor, declared their support for Galba. The Senate quickly followed suit, officially declaring Nero an enemy of the people and condemning him to death. Suddenly, the most powerful man in the world found himself utterly alone. His advisors fled, his servants abandoned the palace, and his remaining friends urged him to commit suicide before his enemies could capture him. The emperor who had once held the power of life and death over millions now faced his own mortality with nothing but terror and regret. And through it all, Sporus stayed, whether out of loyalty, fear, or simply having nowhere else to go. He remained at Nero's side as the emperor's world collapsed around him. What happened next would test the strange bond between them in ways that neither could have anticipated. In his final hours, Nero revealed himself to be neither the monster his enemies described, nor the artistic genius he believed himself to be, but simply a frightened, broken man who had never learned to cope with the consequences of his actions. As reports reached him that enemy soldiers were approaching Rome, Nero's composure finally cracked completely. He paced through the palace corridors, alternately weeping and raging, sometimes talking to himself, sometimes addressing Sporus as if he were still Poppaea. The faithful freedman Phaon offered Nero sanctuary at his villa outside Rome, and the emperor accepted, perhaps hoping that distance from the city might give him time to plan his next move. But as they prepared to leave, Nero faced a crucial decision: what to do about Sporus. Taking him along would be dangerous. Sporus's feminine appearance and elaborate clothing would draw attention, making it harder for Nero to travel undetected. More practically, maintaining the illusion that Sporus was Poppaea required resources, servants, cosmetics, proper clothing that would not be available in hiding. But leaving Sporus behind would mean abandoning the one source of comfort that had sustained Nero through the darkest period of his reign. In Sporus, he had found not just a replacement for his dead wife, but a living testament to his power to reshape reality according to his will. Losing him would mean confronting the full weight of his isolation and guilt. In the end, Nero chose to take Sporus with him. As they fled Rome in disguise, the former emperor clinging to the one relationship that had given his life meaning in recent years, it must have been a pathetic sight. Two figures bound together by obsession and necessity, both trapped in roles they could not escape. They reached Phaon's villa as dawn was breaking on June 9th, 68 AD. Nero was exhausted, paranoid, and increasingly convinced that capture was inevitable. As the day wore on, messengers brought increasingly dire news. Galba was marching on Rome with a large army. The Senate had officially condemned Nero to death. Most ominously, they had specified that he should be executed in the ancient fashion, beaten to death with rods. This prospect terrified Nero more than anything else. He had always prided himself on his sophistication, his artistic sensibilities, his elevation above the crude brutality of common soldiers. To die like a common criminal, beaten and humiliated before a jeering crowd, was a fate worse than death itself. As the sun began to set, Nero made his final decision. He would commit suicide before his enemies could capture him. It was the one dignified option left to him, the one way he could control his own fate. But even in this final act, Nero's character revealed itself. He spent hours working up the courage to drive a dagger into his own throat, repeatedly bringing the blade to his neck, only to pull it away at the last moment. He composed what he believed would be his final poem, lamenting the loss of his artistic talents. He even practiced different ways of dying, as if death were just another performance that required rehearsal. Through all of this, Sporus watched in silence. What was he thinking during those final hours? Was he hoping for Nero's death, seeing it as liberation from the nightmare his life had become? Or had he become so thoroughly conditioned to his role that he genuinely felt sorrow at the prospect of losing the man who had remade him in another's image? We'll never know for certain, because history has preserved almost nothing of Sporus's own voice or perspective. He exists in the historical record only as an object of Nero's obsession, a living doll whose thoughts and feelings were considered irrelevant by the chroniclers of the time. What we do know is that as the sound of approaching horses finally reached the villa, Nero at last found the courage to act. With Sporus and a few remaining servants as witnesses, he pressed a dagger to his throat and spoke his final words. "What an artist dies in me." Even in death, Nero's primary concern was not for the empire he had ruled, not for the people he had governed, not even for the young man whose life he had so thoroughly destroyed, but for his own lost artistic potential. It was perhaps the most fitting end possible for a man whose entire reign had been defined by narcissism and self-delusion. And with Nero's death, Sporus found himself in a position that was both liberated and terrifying. For the first time in years, he was free to be himself. But after so long living as someone else, did he even remember who that self was? The immediate aftermath of Nero's suicide was chaos. Galba's soldiers arrived at the villa to find the emperor's body still warm, surrounded by a handful of terrified servants who expected to be executed for their loyalty to a condemned traitor. But Galba, despite his reputation for severity, proved to be pragmatic rather than vindictive. The servants were questioned and then released, deemed too insignificant to pose any threat to the new regime. As for Sporus, his situation was more complicated. Here was a young man who had been intimately connected to Nero's most scandalous behaviors, a living symbol of the previous emperor's madness and excess. By all rights, he should have been executed immediately, both to eliminate a potential rallying point for Nero's supporters and to send a message that the new administration would tolerate no remnants of the old regime's depravity. But Sporus had also been a victim of Nero's obsessions, mutilated and transformed against his will, forced to live a lie for years under threat of death. This complexity may have saved his life, as Galba's advisors debated what to do with him. In the end, Sporus was spared execution, but not freedom. Instead, he was kept under guard while the new emperor's administration tried to figure out what to do with Nero's most unusual legacy. Galba himself was an elderly man, already in his 70s when he claimed the throne. He had no interest in the young man who had served as Nero's wife, viewing him as nothing more than an embarrassing reminder of his predecessor's excesses. But he also recognized that Sporus represented a unique problem. The young man's very existence was a scandal that could undermine the dignity Galba was trying to restore to the imperial office. Yet executing him might create a martyr for those who still harbored sympathy for Nero. The solution was to keep him alive, but invisible, confined to quarters where he could not remind anyone of the previous regime's most shameful episodes. For Sporus, this period must have been deeply disorienting. After years of living at the center of imperial power, suddenly he was nobody again. Worse than nobody, actually, since he was a living reminder of things the new government wanted everyone to forget. But he was also, for the first time since his capture by Nero's agents, relatively free to be himself. No longer required to dress as Poppaea, no longer forced to mimic her mannerisms and speech patterns, Sporus could begin the difficult process of rediscovering his own identity. Yet this freedom came with its own challenges. After years of suppressing his true self, how could he even remember who he had been before Nero's obsession transformed him? His body had been permanently altered by castration. His mind had been shaped by years of psychological conditioning. In many ways, the person he had been before meeting Nero was as dead as Poppaea herself. This period of limbo would not last long, however. Galba's reign was brief and troubled, marked by financial crises and military unrest. Within 7 months of taking power, he too was dead, assassinated by rivals who saw him as weak and ineffective. The new emperor was Marcus Salvius Otho, and his connection to this story runs deeper than mere chronology. Otho had been Poppaea's first husband, the man Nero had displaced when his obsession with her began. He had been forced to watch helplessly as his wife was stolen by the emperor, then later murdered by the same man who had claimed to love her. Now, unexpectedly, Otho found himself face to face with Sporus, the bizarre creation that had emerged from Nero's grief and guilt over Poppaea's death. Otho's reaction to discovering Sporus among the remnants of Nero's court was complex and deeply personal. Here was a young man who had been transformed into a grotesque mockery of the woman Otho had once loved, a living reminder of both Poppaea's beauty and the horrible circumstances of her death. At first, Otho was reportedly sickened by the sight of Sporus. The resemblance to Poppaea was still strong enough to be unsettling, but it was the resemblance of a distorted mirror, highlighting the artificiality of the transformation while simultaneously evoking painful memories of genuine loss. But as the initial shock wore off, Otho began to see Sporus differently. Perhaps he recognized a fellow victim of Nero's obsessions, someone else whose life had been destroyed by the former emperor's inability to love without possessing, to desire without destroying. Or perhaps Otho saw an opportunity. As emperor, he needed to distinguish himself from both his predecessors, the mad Nero and the ineffective Galba. Taking Sporus under his protection could be seen as an act of mercy that demonstrated the new regime's capacity for forgiveness and healing. Whatever his motivations, Otho made a surprising decision. Instead of having Sporus executed or continuing to keep him hidden away, he integrated him into his own court, not as a wife or concubine, but as a freedman with a position of modest responsibility and respect. For Sporus, this represented the first genuine kindness he had experienced in years. Otho made no demands that he continue to impersonate Poppaea. He was allowed to dress as he chose, though his castration meant that he could never fully appear masculine again. More importantly, he was treated as an individual rather than as someone else's projection or fantasy. This period may have been the closest thing to happiness that Sporus ever experienced. He was safe, relatively free, and for the first time since his transformation, valued for himself rather than for his resemblance to a dead woman. But once again, his newfound stability would be short-lived. Otho's reign lasted only 3 months before he too met a violent end, defeated in battle by Vitellius, another claimant to the throne. The year of the Four Emperors, as 69 AD came to be known, was a period of unprecedented chaos in Roman history. Within 12 months, 4 different men claimed the title of emperor, and 3 of them died violent deaths. The empire seemed to be tearing itself apart, consumed by civil war and political instability. For someone like Sporus, who had no real political power or military connections, this chaos was terrifying. Each change of regime brought the possibility of execution, exile, or worse. He had survived Nero's death and found protection under Galba and then Otho, but now he faced an uncertain future under yet another new ruler. Vitellius, the latest claimant to the throne, was a different kind of man entirely from his predecessors. Where Nero had been artistic and obsessive, Where Galba had been stern and traditional, where Otho had been surprisingly compassionate, Vitellius was crude, gluttonous, and violent. He had won the throne through military might rather than political maneuvering, and he ruled with the blunt instruments of fear and intimidation. When Vitellius discovered Sporus among the remnants of previous imperial courts, his reaction was swift and decisive. Unlike Otho, who had seen in Sporus a fellow victim deserving of protection, Vitellius saw only an embarrassing reminder of Roman decadence that needed to be eliminated. But Vitellius was also a showman who understood the power of public spectacle. Rather than simply having Sporus quietly executed, he conceived of something far more cruel and humiliating. He would force Sporus to participate in a gladiatorial exhibition, dressed as a woman, fighting for his life in front of a cheering crowd. The plan was diabolical in its cruelty. It would provide entertainment for the masses, while simultaneously demonstrating Vitellius's rejection of Nero's excesses. Sporus would be forced to die in the most humiliating way possible, as a spectacle for the amusement of others. His death serving as both punishment for his association with Nero and as a symbol of the new emperor's determination to restore traditional Roman values. But Sporus had endured too much to accept such a fate passively. When he learned of Vitellius's plans, he made a decision that showed remarkable courage and dignity. Rather than submit to this final humiliation, he chose to take control of his own destiny in the only way still available to him. On the night before he was scheduled to appear in the arena, Sporus committed suicide. The exact method is not recorded by the historians, but the act itself represents perhaps the first truly autonomous decision he had made since being captured by Nero's agents years earlier. In death, Sporus finally escaped the prison of other people's expectations and desires. No longer would he be forced to be Poppeia's replacement, Nero's comfort, or Vitellius's entertainment. After years of existing only as a reflection of other people's needs and fantasies, he had at last chosen his own fate. He was probably no more than 20 years old when he died. The death of Sporus might have been the end of this strange story, but his brief life had already left an indelible mark on history. The young man who had been transformed into a living doll had become something more, a symbol of the corrupting effects of absolute power and the human cost of unchecked ambition. The historians of the time were fascinated by Sporus's story, though they approached it from their own cultural perspectives. Tacitus, writing decades later, used the tale as evidence of Nero's complete moral breakdown. Suetonius included it among the most scandalous episodes of imperial excess. Cassius Dio saw it as proof that the gods had withdrawn their favor from Rome itself. But what none of these historians fully grasped was the human dimension of Sporus's tragedy. They saw him primarily as a curiosity, a bizarre footnote to Nero's reign, rather than as an individual who had suffered unimaginable psychological and physical trauma. Their accounts preserve the basic facts of his story, but reveal little about his inner life, his thoughts and feelings, his hopes and fears. This neglect is itself telling. In the hierarchical world of ancient Rome, someone like Sporus, a former slave, a castrated male, a person who existed primarily to serve others' desires, was considered essentially disposable. His suffering mattered only insofar as it reflected on the powerful men who controlled his fate. Yet there are moments in the historical record where Sporus's humanity breaks through the indifference of his chroniclers. The fact that he stayed with Nero during the emperor's final flight suggests loyalty, fear, or perhaps a complex mixture of both. His apparent adaptation to life under Otho indicates a resilience that enabled him to form new relationships even after years of psychological abuse. His final suicide demonstrates a dignity and courage that his tormentors had never been able to completely destroy. These glimpses remind us that behind the scandal and spectacle was a real person who experienced real suffering, someone who maintained some core of selfhood despite years of systematic dehumanization. Sporus's story also reveals uncomfortable truths about the nature of power and victimization that remain relevant today. Nero's treatment of him was not simply the product of individual madness, but the logical extreme of a system that granted absolute authority to one person while reducing others to objects for his use. The emperor's ability to castrate, transform, and essentially enslave Sporus was not an aberration, but an extension of powers that Roman society accepted as normal and necessary. The same legal and social structures that allowed Nero to execute senators and confiscate property also enabled him to remake a human being according to his personal fantasies. In this sense, Sporus was not just Nero's victim, but a victim of the entire imperial system. His tragedy was made possible by laws that treated some people as property, by social norms that valued appearance over autonomy, and by a culture that prioritized the desires of the powerful over the rights of the vulnerable. The parallels between Sporus's story and modern cases of abuse and exploitation are striking and disturbing. Like many victims of psychological manipulation, he was isolated from support systems, forced to depend entirely on his abuser, and gradually conditioned to suppress his own identity in favor of what his captor demanded. The physical transformation imposed on Sporus, the castration, the feminine clothing, the forced adoption of another person's mannerisms, represents an extreme form of what psychologists now recognize as identity erosion. By systematically destroying every aspect of Sporus's original self and replacing it with elements designed to serve Nero's needs, the emperor achieved a form of psychological control that went far beyond simple domination. What makes Sporus's case particularly tragic is that he had no recourse to outside help. In modern situations of abuse, victims can potentially appeal to law enforcement, social services, or advocacy organizations. But in Nero's Rome, the emperor was the law, and challenging his authority meant death. This isolation was compounded by the public nature of Sporus's situation. His transformation and marriage to Nero were not private matters, but imperial policy, witnessed and tacitly endorsed by the highest levels of Roman society. Even those who found the arrangement disturbing were complicit in maintaining it through their silence and participation. The psychological impact of this public complicity cannot be overstated. Sporus was not only forced to live a lie, but to live it in front of an audience that knew the truth but pretended otherwise. This created a form of gaslighting on a massive scale, where reality itself became negotiable based on the emperor's whims. Yet despite all of this, Sporus managed to retain enough sense of self to form genuine relationships with people like Otho, and ultimately to choose death over further humiliation. This suggests a strength of character that his tormentors could never completely break, a core of human dignity that survived even the most extreme efforts to destroy it. His story also highlights the particular vulnerabilities faced by those who exist on the margins of society. As a former slave and a person whose appearance and manner didn't conform to conventional gender expectations, Sporus had few protections and little social standing. These factors made him an ideal target for someone like Nero, who needed a victim who could be transformed without significant consequences. The intersection of gender, class, and power in Sporus' story remains painfully relevant today. Around the world, people who don't fit conventional expectations about gender and sexuality continue to face discrimination, violence, and exploitation. Their marginalized status makes them vulnerable to abuse, while simultaneously making it harder for them to seek help or receive justice. In many ways, Sporus represents all those who have been forced to sacrifice their authentic selves to serve others' needs and fantasies. His story is a reminder that behind every historical scandal, every tale of imperial excess, are real human beings whose suffering deserves to be acknowledged and remembered. The broader historical context of Sporus' story reveals troubling patterns that extended far beyond his individual case. The Roman Empire, for all its achievements in law, engineering, and governance, was built on a foundation of systematic dehumanization that made tragedies like his not only possible, but inevitable. The institution of slavery, which affected millions of people throughout the Roman world, created a vast population of individuals who had no legal rights and existed entirely at the mercy of their owners. While some slaves achieved positions of relative comfort and influence, they remained property that could be bought, sold, or disposed of according to their master's wishes. Even freed slaves like Sporus found themselves in an ambiguous position. Though legally free, they remained bound to their former masters and dependent on their goodwill for survival. This created a class of people who were neither fully enslaved nor truly free, vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, with little recourse to justice. The Roman attitude towards sexuality further complicated Sporus' situation. While Roman society was relatively tolerant of homosexual relationships, these were expected to follow strict hierarchical patterns, with older, more powerful men taking dominant roles over younger, less powerful partners. The relationship between Nero and Sporus fit this pattern in some ways, but violated it in others, particularly through the public nature of their marriage and Nero's insistence on treating Sporus as a wife rather than a male lover. The castration of Sporus also reflected broader practices that were becoming more common in the Roman world through contact with Eastern cultures. Eunuchs served in various capacities throughout the empire, particularly in roles that required them to work closely with women or to serve as trusted intermediaries. But the deliberate creation of eunuchs for personal gratification, as opposed to administrative necessity, was still relatively rare and scandalous. Nero's treatment of Sporus can also be understood within the context of imperial marriage practices more generally. Roman emperors had long used marriage as a tool of political alliance and personal advancement, with wives often serving primarily as symbols of their husband's power and status. Poppaea herself had been married first to Otho and then to Nero, largely because of her beauty and social connections, rather than for love or personal compatibility. In transforming Sporus into a replacement for Poppaea, Nero was taking this instrumentalization of marriage to its logical extreme. If wives were essentially decorative objects designed to enhance their husband's prestige, then why not create the perfect wife from scratch, designed to exact specifications and incapable of independent action? This attitude toward marriage and relationships was not unique to Nero, but reflected broader cultural assumptions about gender, power, and personal autonomy that pervaded Roman society. Women, even wealthy and influential ones, were expected to subordinate their own desires to those of their male relatives. Children could be sold abandoned or killed by their fathers, without legal consequences. Personal relationships were often viewed primarily through the lens of social and economic advantage, rather than emotional connection. Against this background, Sporus's transformation becomes not just an individual tragedy, but a symptom of larger social problems that affected countless people throughout the Roman world. His story illuminates the human cost of systems that treat people as objects and reduce personal relationships to transactions of power and control. The reign of Vespasian, who finally brought stability to the empire after the chaos of 69 AD, marked the beginning of a new era in Roman history. The Flavian dynasty would rule for nearly 3 decades, ushering in a period of prosperity and relative peace that allowed the empire to recover from the trauma of civil war. But the memory of Nero's excesses, including his relationship with Sporus, continued to haunt the imperial office. Subsequent emperors were acutely aware of the need to maintain public dignity and avoid the kind of scandals that had undermined their predecessors' authority. The story of Sporus became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen when imperial power was exercised without restraint or moral consideration. The historians who recorded these events were similarly influenced by the need to understand and explain how the Roman system had gone so badly wrong. Their accounts of Nero's reign, including the story of Sporus, served multiple purposes. They provided entertainment for readers fascinated by imperial scandal. They offered moral lessons about the dangers of unchecked power, and they helped legitimize the current regime by contrasting its virtues with the vices of its predecessors. But these historical accounts also reflected the biases and limitations of their authors. Writing primarily for male, elite audiences, historians like Tacitus and Suetonius were more interested in the political implications of Nero's behavior than in its human cost. They saw Sporus as a symbol rather than a person, a representation of imperial decadence rather than an individual who had suffered and died. This perspective has shaped how the story has been remembered and retold throughout history. Medieval and Renaissance writers, drawing on classical sources, continued to emphasize the scandalous aspects of the relationship while ignoring its human dimensions. Modern historians have been somewhat more sensitive to Sporus's victimization, but even contemporary accounts often focus more on what his story reveals about Nero than on what it meant for Sporus himself. The persistence of this perspective reflects broader patterns in how history is written and remembered. The experiences of the powerful are preserved in detail, while those of their victims are often reduced to footnotes or ignored entirely. The voices of the marginalized, slaves, women, minorities, those who exist outside conventional social categories, are systematically excluded from historical narratives that claim to tell the complete story of the past. In Sporus's case, this exclusion is particularly tragic because his story has so much to teach us about the nature of power, identity, and human resilience. His experience offers insights into how people survive extreme trauma, how they maintain dignity in the face of dehumanization, and how they find ways to assert their humanity even in the most oppressive circumstances. By focusing primarily on Nero's motivations and actions, traditional historical accounts have missed the opportunity to explore these deeper themes. They have treated Sporus as a passive object rather than as an active agent who made choices, formed relationships, and ultimately determined his own fate. Recent scholarship has begun to approach Sporus's story with greater sensitivity to issues of gender, sexuality, and personal autonomy. Researchers have noted parallels between his experience and those of other individuals throughout history who have been forced to cross gender boundaries, whether through coercion, social pressure, or personal choice. Some scholars have suggested that Sporus' story might be better understood through the lens of transgender studies, noting that his transformation from male to female presentation involved not just clothing and behavior, but also physical modification. While it's impossible to know whether Sporus would have chosen such a transformation if given the option, his ability to adapt to his new role suggests a complexity of identity that traditional historical accounts have failed to explore. Others have focused on the psychological aspects of his experience, drawing on modern understanding of trauma, identity formation, and survival strategies. These analyses suggest that Sporus' apparent compliance with Nero's demands may have been a sophisticated form of resistance, a way of maintaining some control over his situation while appearing to submit completely to his captor's will. The question of Sporus' agency is particularly complex. On one hand, he was clearly a victim of extreme coercion, forced to undergo physical transformation and psychological conditioning against his will. On the other hand, he made choices within the constraints of his situation that demonstrate remarkable intelligence and adaptability. His decision to remain with Nero during the emperor's final flight could be interpreted as Stockholm Syndrome, the psychological phenomenon where hostages develop positive feelings toward their captors. But it could equally be seen as a rational calculation that his chances of survival were better with Nero than without him, at least in the short term. Similarly, his apparent success in winning Otho's protection suggests that he was able to present himself effectively as deserving of sympathy and support. This required social skills and emotional intelligence that go far beyond mere passive compliance. His final decision to commit suicide rather than face humiliation in the arena represents perhaps the clearest assertion of his autonomy. Faced with a choice between death on his own terms and death as entertainment for others, he chose to control the manner and timing of his end. These moments of agency, however limited by circumstances, remind us that Sporus was not simply a victim, but a complex individual who navigated an impossible situation with remarkable resilience and dignity. The story of Sporus has continued to fascinate writers, artists, and thinkers throughout the centuries since his death. His tragic fate has been referenced in literature, adapted for the stage, and analyzed by scholars interested in questions of power, identity, and human nature. During the Renaissance, when classical antiquity was experiencing renewed interest, writers like Montaigne referenced Sporus' story as an example of the corrupting effects of absolute power. The bizarre nature of his relationship with Nero fit perfectly with humanist critiques of tyranny and excess, serving as a cautionary tale about what happened when rulers were not constrained by law or moral principle. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as European societies grappled with questions of political reform and social progress, Sporus' story took on new relevance. Writers and philosophers used his fate to argue for constitutional government, individual rights, and the protection of vulnerable populations from abuse by those in power. The 20th century brought new perspectives on the story, influenced by developments in psychology, sociology, and gender studies. Scholars began to see Sporus not just as a symbol of imperial excess, but as a case study in trauma, identity, and survival. His experience provided insights into how people cope with extreme situations and maintain their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Contemporary discussions of the story often focus on its relevance to modern issues of consent, bodily autonomy, and gender identity. Sporus' forced transformation has been compared to various forms of contemporary abuse and exploitation, while his apparent adaptation to his new role has been analyzed in the context of current understanding of trauma responses and survival strategies. Some modern retellings have attempted to give Sporus a voice that the historical record denies him, imagining his thoughts and feelings during the various stages of his ordeal. While these fictional accounts cannot claim historical accuracy, they serve an important function in humanizing a figure who has too often been treated as merely a symbol or curiosity. These contemporary perspectives remind us that Sporus' story is not just ancient history, but a mirror that reflects ongoing human struggles with power, identity, and dignity. The circumstances of his life may be specific to first-century Rome, but the human experiences he represents, trauma, resilience, the search for agency in impossible circumstances, are universal and timeless. Perhaps the most important lesson of Sporus' story is the reminder that behind every historical scandal, every tale of imperial excess or political intrigue, are real human beings whose experiences deserve to be remembered and understood. The tendency to reduce complex individuals to symbols or footnotes impoverishes our understanding of the past and limits our ability to learn from it. Sporus lived in a world where his life could be completely transformed by the whims of those more powerful than himself. His body could be mutilated, his identity erased, his future determined entirely by others' needs and desires. Yet even in these extreme circumstances, he found ways to maintain his dignity and assert his humanity. His story challenges us to think more deeply about the nature of power and its effects on both those who wield it and those who are subject to it. Nero's ability to transform Sporus, according to his fantasies, was not just the product of individual madness, but the logical result of social systems that treated some people as objects rather than subjects. These systems have not disappeared with the fall of the Roman Empire. Around the world today, millions of people find themselves in situations where their autonomy is limited or denied entirely. They may be victims of human trafficking, forced labor, or other forms of exploitation. They may be refugees, prisoners, or members of marginalized communities who lack legal protections or social support. Like Sporus, many of these individuals demonstrate remarkable resilience in the face of overwhelming challenges. They find ways to survive, to maintain relationships, to preserve some sense of self, even when everything seems designed to strip away their humanity. Their stories, like his, deserve to be told not just as cautionary tales or historical curiosities, but as testimonies to the strength of the human spirit and the importance of protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. Sporus' brief life also reminds us of the importance of bearing witness to suffering, even when we cannot prevent or remedy it. The Roman historians who recorded his story may have been motivated primarily by sensationalism or political considerations, but they performed an essential service by preserving the memory of his experience. In our own time, we have both greater opportunities and greater responsibilities to document and remember the experiences of those who suffer abuse and exploitation. We have better tools for understanding trauma and its effects, more sophisticated legal frameworks for protecting individual rights, and more widespread recognition of the importance of giving voice to the voiceless. Yet we also live in a world where new forms of exploitation and dehumanization continue to emerge, where technology creates new vulnerabilities even as it offers new protections, where global inequality and political instability put millions of people at risk of experiences not unlike what Sporus endured. The final chapters of Sporus' story, his brief period of relative freedom under Otho, his determination to die with dignity rather than be humiliated by Vitellius, offer perhaps the most powerful testament to his character. After years of being forced to live according to others' demands, he was finally able to make choices that reflected his own values and priorities. These choices reveal a person of remarkable courage and integrity. Despite everything he had endured, despite the physical and psychological trauma that had been inflicted upon him, Sporus retained a core sense of self that his tormentors could never completely destroy. His relationship with Otho suggests that he was capable of forming genuine human connections even after years of abuse. The fact that Otho, who had every reason to despise him as a reminder of his own humiliation, instead chose to protect him, speaks to Sporus's ability to inspire sympathy and respect in those who knew him personally. His final act of suicide, while tragic, was also an assertion of agency that denied his enemies the satisfaction of controlling even his death. In choosing to die on his own terms, rather than as a spectacle for others' entertainment, Sporus demonstrated that his spirit remained unbroken despite everything he had suffered. This ending, while sad, also offers a kind of redemption. After years of existing primarily as a projection of other people's needs and fantasies, Sporus's final act was entirely his own. In death, he achieved something that had been denied to him in life: the freedom to be himself. The young man who had been kidnapped, mutilated, and transformed into a living doll had become something more, a symbol of human resilience, a reminder that dignity cannot be taken away by force, only surrendered by choice. His story resonates across the centuries because it speaks to fundamental questions about what it means to be human, what it means to have worth and dignity independent of how others see us or use us. In a world that often reduces people to their utility or their ability to serve others' desires, Sporus's life and death remind us that every individual has inherent value that cannot be destroyed by external circumstances. Today, more than 2,000 years after his death, Sporus remains a figure who challenges our understanding of power, identity, and human resilience. His story has been told and retold countless times, each generation finding in it reflections of their own concerns and struggles. For the Romans who first recorded his story, he was primarily a symbol of imperial decadence, evidence of what happened when power was exercised without moral restraint. Medieval and Renaissance writers saw in him a cautionary tale about the corrupting effects of absolute authority. Modern scholars have found in his experience insights into trauma, identity formation, and survival strategies. But perhaps the most important way to remember Sporus is not as a symbol or case study, but as an individual who lived and suffered, and ultimately found a way to assert his own dignity in impossible circumstances. His life reminds us that behind every historical statistic, every tale of oppression or exploitation, are real people with their own hopes, fears, dreams, and struggles. The world has changed dramatically since Sporus's time. We have developed more sophisticated understanding of human psychology, more comprehensive frameworks for protecting individual rights, and more effective mechanisms for holding the powerful accountable for their actions. Yet the fundamental challenges his story represents, the abuse of power, the exploitation of the vulnerable, the struggle to maintain dignity in the face of dehumanization, remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Rome. His story calls us to be vigilant against systems and individuals that treat people as objects rather than subjects, that prioritize the desires of the powerful over the rights of the vulnerable. It reminds us of the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and of giving voice to those whose experiences might otherwise be forgotten or ignored. Most importantly, it challenges us to see beyond the scandals and spectacles that often dominate historical narratives, to the human experiences that lie beneath them. Every person who has ever lived has a story worth telling, a perspective worth understanding, a dignity worth defending. Sporus's brief life ended in tragedy, but his memory serves as a testament to the indestructible nature of human worth. No matter how completely someone may be controlled, exploited, or dehumanized by others, there remains within them something that cannot be taken away, a core of self that persists even in the darkest circumstances. In remembering his story, we honor not just his individual experience, but the experiences of all those throughout history who have suffered similar fates. We acknowledge their pain, celebrate their resilience, and commit ourselves to creating a world where such tragedies become increasingly impossible. The young man who was forced to live as someone else's fantasy ultimately achieved something that his tormentors never could. He became unforgettable. 2 millennia after his death, we still speak his name, still wrestle with the questions his life raises, still find in his story truths about human nature that transcend the specific circumstances of his time and place. That, perhaps, is the most fitting memorial for someone who is denied so much in life, that his story continues to speak to the human condition, continues to challenge our assumptions about power and dignity, continues to remind us of the importance of seeing and remembering those whom history might otherwise forget. In the end, Sporus achieved something that neither Nero nor any of his other tormentors could claim. His story became immortal, not because of the power he wielded or the things he accomplished, but because of the courage he showed and the dignity he maintained in the face of unimaginable circumstances. His life was brief and largely shaped by forces beyond his control, but his memory endures as a reminder of the indestructible worth of every human being and the importance of bearing witness to both the worst and the best of human nature. In remembering him, we honor not just his individual struggle, but the ongoing human quest for dignity, autonomy, and recognition in a world that too often treats people as disposable. The story of Sporus, the boy who was turned into a replacement for an emperor's dead wife, ultimately became something far more significant, a testament to the unbreakable nature of the human spirit, and a call to vigilance against the abuse of power in all its forms. That lesson, learned at such terrible cost, remains as urgent today as it was 2,000 years ago.